My sisters and brothers, the Epiphany story, a reading from St. Matthew. In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, "Where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising and have come to pay him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was frightened, and all of Jerusalem with him. And calling together all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Messiah was to be born. And they told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea. For so it's written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod secretly called for the wise men and learned from them the exact time when the star had appeared. And then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you've found him, bring me word that I also may go and pay him homage." And when they had heard the king, they set out. And there ahead of them went the star that they had seen at its rising, until it stopped over the place where the child was. And when they saw that the star had stopped, they were overwhelmed with joy. And on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. And they knelt down and paid him homage. And then, opening their treasure chests, they offered him gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they left for their own country by another road. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church.
Pray with me. O Lord, take my lips and speak through them. Take all of our minds and calm them. Open them to hear your voice. Take our hearts, set them on fire with love for you. Amen. As we celebrate Epiphany, the question arises, where does one look for God? The wise men that we celebrate today came looking for a king. They had seen a star. They knew that something wonderful was happening. Their biggest problem was that they initially looked in the wrong place. They went to the palaces in Jerusalem because it seemed to them logical that that would be the place they would find a new king. A little out-of-the-way place, a little nothing place like Bethlehem never even appeared on their radar screen. They were looking in the wrong place. Maybe we should call them just the three kings instead of the three wise men. There was recently a piece on the internet about how things would have been very different had the three wise men been three women. It said three wise women would have asked directions at the very beginning of their journey. They would have arrived on time. They would have helped deliver the baby. They would have quickly cleaned the stable, made a casserole, and brought practical gifts. And there would be peace on earth. I'm not going to debate that. It could be a costly debate. But where do we look for God? There's an old story about the king of Balak, which is now northern Afghanistan. His name was Ephraim Adam. And Ephraim was very wealthy according to every earthly measure. But at the same time, he very sincerely wanted to be wealthy spiritually. And one night, this king was roused from his sleep by all this noise on the roof of his house. And he shouted out, "Who's there?" The voice came back, "A friend. I've lost my camel." Well, Ephraim screamed out, "You fool! Why are you looking for a camel on the roof of my house?" After a moment, the voice came back and said, "You fool! You're looking for God in silk clothing and a golden bed." The story goes on, according to Jesuit theologian Walter Burkhardt, to tell that these simple words filled the king with such terror that he arose from his bed and became a remarkable saint as a result of it. And that camel on the roof raises the question for us. Where are you and I looking for God today? It's a compelling question. And it's an important question as we begin a new year. And our text raises that camel on the roof question for all of us in one way or another. It's a reminder that God isn't always found in the ways and in the places that we expect. We're called to be like the king's friend, to sometimes make a bit of a fool of ourselves by asking that question of a world that is so often filled with fear. In Epiphany, God reaches beyond the shepherds, the story we heard about, who are at the very bottom of the social scale, to now reaching to the very top, the three kings, the wise men, people of education and status. God reaches beyond those shepherds who were scared witless by God's glory to a group who observed a star rising and followed that star because they were sure something was at the end of that journey. All along the way, God directs them with a star, with a little verse from Micah, and finally at the end of the story with a wondrous dream. Harry Pritchard, in Another Way Home, suggests that for all of us, our return to ordinary life after Christmas is kind of like the wise men returning back home. And we have to ask, what difference did the wise men's journey make in their lives? After having that vision in Bethlehem and seeing all those things, were they any different? And does it make a difference for us that we've been through that joy of Christmas? And as long as we hold on to that vision, it's important. But we realize so often that Christmas just doesn't seem to have changed the world very much. That's probably because the world we encounter each day is much like Herod's world, a place where there's order and control, a place that's drained of its mystery, of its wonder, a place where sometimes even our religious practices lack some of the wonder we wish they had. And it becomes a system of rights and wrongs and rituals. But mystery and wonder are the very things that our hearts cry out for. Our souls long for something that's greater than we are. There has to be more to life than just what we see. And we long for hope. Hope that the world does not deliver to us. When we look around us, we experience all kinds of political and social and economic poverty. We sometimes feel powerless as violence and terrorism explode across the world. We hear all the macho words of all of our political leaders, yet see very little happen. And we sense that the world is kind of out of control and headed for a nightmare of nuclear or toxic waste. And we know that we have to reach beyond that, reach beyond what we just see to find hope. So what can we do? Where are we going to find God in the midst of all this? Well, we can decide to resist Herod with all of his guises and go back home by another way. We can resist all that kills children and that childlike wonder of imagination and optimism and hope and play and creativity and adventure. We can decide to pay better attention to life, the silences, the noise, the joy, to live a little less hurriedly and be a little more open to our imagination. As children, most of us had vivid imaginations, but somehow we've lost that. And we need some of that creativity back in our lives to see that little shimmering star for ourselves. And when we look and listen, we have to decide if we're going to find God. But God is everywhere. There is nowhere we go that God is not. So we come to church, not to see all the others, although we enjoy that, but to seek and to find and to again be reminded that God is with us at every moment and in every situation. And God seems to be doing whatever it takes to reach out and embrace all people. God announced the birth of the Messiah to the shepherds, then to the wise men by a star, and to the political and religious leaders of that day by the visit of these visitors from the east. God's embrace through Christ gets bigger and bigger. We look at Jesus. He eats with outcasts and sinners. He touches people who are sick people who are disabled. He even calls the dead back to life. Ultimately, Jesus draws all people to himself to tell us that none of us are beyond God's embrace. And so the wise men came. They came seeking something special and something new through that star they had seen in the sky. And perhaps it's the presence of these three wise men and their quest to find this Messiah and announcing that the world is changing that tells us that God is approaching us and nothing remains the same when we've experienced the presence of God. The arrival of these wandering astronomers signals that God's embrace is reaching out. There's no longer insiders and outsiders, but that all are included in God's love. We read today from Matthew's Nativity, and it moves very quickly from this joyous moment of celebration and gifts and adoration by the three kings to a very dark and troubled world with political intrigue, with deception, with violence. That's the reason we like to read Luke on Christmas. It's a happier, more joyous story. But Matthew's account is very sober. And it's also in some ways very realistic. Because we live in a world that is often filled with fear and superstorms and elementary school massacres. A world where innocents die every day from preventable diseases and hunger. And in Matthew's story, the visit of the wise men is followed immediately by the slaughter of the innocents. Matthew renders an account of the world that we really do live in. And that's kind of the heart of Matthew's darker story of the birth. The promise that it is precisely this world that we live in that God came to. That it's this people, it's us that God came to. People who sometimes do unthinkable things to each other. It's this need that we have that God remedies. That Jesus is Emmanuel, the term we've heard over and over at Christmas. God with us. The living, breathing promise that God has chosen to live among us. So that through the resurrection of Christ, we'll have new life. The word epiphany means to shine on something, to give light, to see something new. And that's what the wise men tell us. Sometimes we need to see something new and in a different way. Dr. Brian Kirkland tells a story of encountering something very special in his life. He says, I was traveling to preach on the West Coast and I needed that long flight to prepare and to study. So I got on the plane and I buckled down and I let everyone near me feel that tension. It was my way of saying, don't bother me, I'm a busy man, I got places to go and I got things to do. He said, and just as I sat down, a young woman with a baby slipped into the seat right next to me. And I thought, this is a problem. So I kept my straight face, looking as Presbyterian as I possibly could. He said it lasted about 6 minutes. Here's this little tiny boy grabbing my sleeve going, man, man. He said I couldn't resist, so I took my sermon and I shoved it back in my briefcase and I picked him up out of the seat and just played with him and enjoyed him the rest of the way across the country. And he said when we landed in Los Angeles, his mother grabbed my arm and said, thank you for doing that. He lost his father not long ago. He has no man to play with him and love him. Thank you so very much. Kirkland says that as he got off the plane and pushed his way through the crowd, got back to his hurried life, he realized how much joy and peace that little boy had brought to him when he least expected it. Emmanuel, God with us, both in the most likely and unlikely of events, places, and circumstances. God is with us. But where is God? Sometimes we look around and we wonder. A little boy came in the house one day from playing hide and seek, and there were tears running down his face. His father took the child and wrapped him in his arms, and he said, what's wrong? The child tearfully explained that he and his friends had been playing hide and seek, and he had hidden himself, and no one looked for him. His father kissed the little boy and he said, "My child, now you know how God feels. God is always in our midst and waits patiently for us to open ourselves to experience that wonder of God's amazing presence." So where do we look for God today? Where do we encounter that divine? Where are those places where we see God with us? The places are around us. It's going on all the time. But we're so busy with life and distracted by so much, many times we fail to notice. When my daughter was about 3 or 4 years old, which is more years ago than I want to remember, my parents had come for a visit, and my father decided his duty was to take my daughter for a walk around the block one afternoon. And he later wrote about that walk, and he said, "I can't remember it ever taking that long to walk around one block." He said, "My granddaughter had to stop and inspect every insect, every stick, and everything that caught her eye. And she, being much closer to the ground than I, saw things I hadn't noticed for many years. That walk made me realize there is so much wonder in the world that I was missing because of my hurried life. I was forced to once again see the wonder and awe of creation through the eyes of a child." I'm afraid that too often we fail to see God among us and with us. So where is God? I think God calls out to us every day and in so many ways. But we're so busy and so consumed with everything else, we fail to listen, we fail to hear. We want something dramatic. We want the roof to fall off and God to suddenly explode into our midst, when many times God just speaks to us in a still and small voice. But God speaks to us constantly and in many ways. Today we gather at the Lord's table. It's a time and place where God reaches out to us to tell us about love, forgiveness, and hope. Will we listen? For when we experience God is with us moments, things change. They changed for the wise men. They had a dream after they had seen that moment of God with them, and they returned home by a different route. Now, where the wise men went when they returned by another way is not important. But how they went back to their life after that encounter is important. They went back wiser because they had seen this divine reality and would be more alert for signs in that in their life. They went back happier with the joy that comes with being a generous giver. They returned as people changed because they had experienced the presence of God with us. So where is God? Right here in our midst, standing among us in so many different ways, waiting for us to open our eyes and our ears to experience God and all the wonders of life. When we open ourselves to God and we find that truth, that God is with us, we go back to life in a different way also. Our route changes. We may not change completely, but we're a little different. Every time we experience God, we change a little bit. We find a little piece of peace, a little glimpse of new hope. So may the wisdom of the wise men set you in motion on a quest for the ever-present God. May their gifts inspire you to have a spirit of giving and self-giving, not just in this season, but in all the days of your life. May your pilgrimage be lighted like theirs, with your own special star, to keep you going when you're weary and afraid, to assure you that God is always there for you, even at the end of the road and beyond. May you experience God's wondrous presence each and every day of your life. Amen.